Hi, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the State of Leadership, Simple and Beyond. That is Robert Hilliard. I am Whitney Wiley, and we are here on Thursdays talking all things leadership, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. And as you can see, if you watch your show regularly, I'm not in my home studio. I am on the road, had been working out of town the past couple of days. So I hopefully have found a private spot in the hotel. So if I get evicted, Robert can continue to, to do the show. Or if someone walks in and I have to acknowledge them, that is why. So we are appropriate for our topic today. Right? We're going to be talking about change and how change can be made easier, how we can work through the resistance. And part of that is just understanding the process, understanding what change is, why we have resistance to it, and some techniques or some strategies that we can use to overcome it. We're actually going to do this episode, we're going to do this topic in two episodes, in two parts. So this is part one, and we will continue this next week for part two. So whether you are watching this live or watching it in replay, know that there are two parts, and you should look for part one if you are currently watching part two, haven't seen part one, or watch part one, make sure you catch part two eventually. So, any, let's say, uh, change is one of those things, right? That is a constant. And it's not just a cliche that people say that change is a constant. It is. It's it's always happening, whether we plan for it or not, whether we want it or not. And despite the fact that it is ever present, we still have resistance to it. And there are some reasons for that. And we're going to talk about some of them. But Robert, before we dig into this topic, any opening thoughts?
No, you know that change is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So this is appropriate. It's appropriate.
It is appropriate. And I guess it's time for vacuuming. So if you hear some humming in the background, well, they're on the other side of the room, but eventually they'll come this way. So
I hear,
again, right? Change, and we have to adapt to what is. So I'm where I am, and this is what it is, and so right, we deal. Um, but look, let's start by looking at why change is so challenging. And we've all experienced our own resistance to change. I'm going to share later something that I went through after. I can talk about a couple of different changes that have happened that were changes that I actually wanted, and still the resistance was there, right? And we'll talk about what that was about and why that happened. So it's not just we don't want change because it's something bad that's happening, even when it's things that we want and the change is positive. Yeah, we can still experience that. And uh, some of what comes out of that resistance, and we've talked about this aspect on the show before, is that resistance is information, right? It's feedback, and it's an opportunity to get some additional understanding of what's going on so that you can navigate what the change is about. And so, not just seeing resistance, particularly if you're in leadership and leading some sort of change process within your organization or within your team, to see that team members are resistant and you're going, oh, they just don't like change, right? You can't leave it there, that you should explore why there's resistance, what that resistance is telling you. And it could be that they just need to adapt. Maybe they need time. Maybe they need more information. Maybe, it could be a host of things. And so instead of just, putting the hands up and say they need to get over it, the change is happening, let's move forward, find out what's going on, and see if there might be something instructive or helpful that comes from that as part of the process.
Yeah, I think I want to even go back just a little bit
Hmm.
further and really let's kind of define change. And we talked about that in another episode, but change is usually something external. Now, when I say external, it doesn't mean that it's happening out in the universe. It could be happening inside your body, right? But it is external. It is beyond your control. It sometimes happens really quickly. The other thing that we talk about when it comes to change is the transition. That's the emotional effect of the change, and that happens slowly. There are, because of the way we are set up psychologically, there is a process I'm not going to speak for every human on the planet, but most people have to go through a certain emotional process before they can get to the other side of change. And that we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think the next thing up is really why people resist change. But I just wanted to
Yes.
explain that really quickly.
No, that's helpful, right? To understand what it is, what we're talking about, putting some context around what we're talking about. And then our goal is to help you and to help you help your people make change easier, and by doing that, addressing the things that get in the way. And the big part of that is resistance. And so we're going to spend an appreciable amount of time talking about resistance, why we resist, and how to move through that resistance. And so resistance, as I mentioned, it's feedback, right? It's the obstacles, the roadblocks, the emotions that people put up when something is happening, some change is happening, and it's not being able to deal with it, right? And I was thinking about this, Robert, because I'm struggling with something currently, and it's been a long time struggle, quite frankly. And when I stopped to think about it, I was like, this actually is change. And your struggle is the resistance to change. And I'm working to figure out what that resistance is about. Right. And the fact that this thing that I want hasn't happened, isn't happening as, I'll just say, as quickly as I would have liked, since it's something that's been going on for a while. It's like, why are you having a resistance to this? What's underlying that? And how can I, use what I know, the tools that I know, the strategies that I know, to actually move through this, instead of sort of not thinking about it in this context. And so it turns out this is very appropriate. It's very timely for me because I wasn't viewing it in that context. And so I think, again, going through this process, thinking about this is helpful. So some of the things that get in the way of and create resistance is fear, right? There's a fear of the unknown. So change is that there's a state, the change happens, then there's a new state, and there's fear of what's on the other side, right? And if I don't know what's over there, I don't know what it's going to be like, then I can have some resistance around it, have some fear about it, because either I don't know what's happening on the other side, or maybe I don't know and understand how I fit in and relate to what's on the other side.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is that as human beings, we've evolved to crave stability and control. And when things, which is why you'll see people in we can use any kind of analogy, a job, a relationship, a home, where things aren't great, but it's relatively stable. They resist change, even if that change is going to put them in a better place. So we see that we like stability. We like things that are predictable. We like things that are pretty much controllable. At least we know how to respond in those situations. Which is why, for me, the most useful, I think the most useful change, and we talk about change, change management models, things like that, are the ones that deal with the human side of it, the emotions, particularly things like grief and sadness, because losing something, when somebody tells you you have to stop doing something, or you see that the thing that you've not necessarily enjoyed, but the thing you got used to is no longer gone, it can feel like a type of death, or like you're losing something. So that's why I like those models when it comes to change.
And so you talked about predictability, stability, right? And our desire, our natural, innate desire to have that. And so when we understand that that's a huge part of it, right? What I find interesting is that breaking this down makes it possible to tackle the pieces, right? And so if you don't know that it's about predictability, it's about stability, it's about it's not that someone is resistant to be is it recalcitrant,
Yeah, it's one of those
right?
big SAT.
They're not resisting to be a problem,
Mhm.
right? It's not that people are intentionally trying to create problems. It is, as Robert has mentioned a couple of times, there's an emotional component that is a part of this. And if I feel like I'm losing control, even if I have limited control, right? Or that it's not going to be familiar, I'm losing something, even if what I'm gaining is greater. It's sort of what's the adage? The devil you know, right? And so I know what to expect here, even if it's not great. I don't know what to expect over there. And it could be better, but maybe it's worse. And we've talked about this. We all sort of naturally, not all, but most of us naturally have a negativity bias that we have to proactively, intentionally work to get through or get around, right? And so if the people on your team are not particularly self-aware about their negativity bias, and you introduce some sort of change process, and there's not a thorough examination, explanation, open transparency around it, excuse me, helping people to understand what's going to be different and how that is a benefit, excuse me, and how that's a benefit, then you are going to get people pushing back. And you're wondering why, but it's going to be better. Maybe it will, maybe it won't.
Yeah, and the thing that we need to understand as leaders is especially if we are the ones that are initiating the change, or even if we knew about it before other people, is the thing that we talk about, the marathon effect. You've had a head start to go through whatever it is you went through, but we tend to think that people should be right there with us when we introduce it to them for the first time. And most of us naturally will resist any type of change. You've heard me use this analogy. If a stranger walked up to you and with a suitcase with $1 million in it and said, "Here, this is yours," you would be, okay, I need to know a few things before I take this money. That's how most of us, I would dare say 99% of the people on the planet would, would pause, because it is our natural tendency to wait and check things out. We've evolved this way over years because you just don't turn a corner, right? You're living in a cave and you're like, oh, I discovered a new place. Let me go stick my head into this cave, this other cave, and find out. Well, that's how you get your head bit off. So we've learned to be cautious about things, about the unknown. So as leaders, we can't expect people to be lockstep with us when we've heard about it
Yeah,
long before we're telling our people, or we are initiating it and then letting our folks know about it. We've had the time to psychologically walk through it and get to acceptance.
absolutely. So, there's fear, there's the familiarity. We like being comfortable, right? We seek comfort, and we seek comfort often in things that are not beneficial or helpful for us. And so when it comes time to letting go of that comfort, again, you're going to have some resistance to that because people want to hold on to things that they're comfortable with. We want stability, we want predictability, we want comfort. And we want to know that when we stick our head in in a cave, right, that it's safe to do that, or that when some stranger walks up with a suitcase with $1 million, that it's not going to get us in trouble. It's not stolen. It doesn't belong to the mob. Somebody's not going to come after us, right, to harm us, to take it back, et cetera, et cetera. So, when we think about it in sort of these extreme ways, you can see it. It's a little less obvious when it's about restructuring an organization, right? Maybe that someone would be fearful um, that you're bringing a new product on, or adding a new service, or a new department, or a new level of management. It, it's not quite the same thing as sticking your head in a hole, a dark hole or a dark cave. So, why would someone have a problem with that? And while the circumstances may be different, the fears there are the same. I don't know what that means, right? I don't know do I get a new manager? Is this new level going to have an impact on my salary? And I'll just say, years ago, I was in an organization. We went through a a restructuring. We added a new level of um, management in there, and there was widespread resistance from staff, and the response from leadership was basically, we've made the decision to do this, deal with it, let's move on, rather than hearing out what staff had to say. And here's the interesting thing, that the very fears that were articulated to the consultant and the focus groups came to pass. And so that's why say, taking the time to hear what people have to say and dig into why there is resistance can be informative for whatever your change process is. Um, on a more personal level, I will say this: I got married, and I don't know if I've shared this story here before, but a couple of years after I got married, I was at an event, and I ran into someone who had gotten married a little while after I had. And we were having a conversation about how things were going in our respective marriages. And what was really interesting is we had sort of similar stories. It was my second marriage, her second marriage. Both of us had been single in between the two marriages for a pretty long time, right? When you are single and an adult, right, you form your ways of and how you do things, and how you live life and run your house and whatnot. And both of us wanted to be married, right? So getting to that point about, even when you want the change, I hadn't really stopped to think about what and you talked about the transition, right? And we can get into that, but what it means. So one minute you're single, someone, justice of the peace, a preacher, whomever, pronounces you husband and wife. There is a change, right? In that moment, you go from being single to being married. The change itself wasn't as much of the problem as the transition into being a married person, right? Which takes a longer time. The change was instantaneous. The transition to being a married person from a single person took a little longer, and it takes some intentionality. And so there was some resistance there I wasn't aware of until she and I had a conversation, right? And it what's really interesting is that my husband had pointed it out and I didn't really make the connection. She and I had the conversation, and she was saying basically her husband had said the same thing. And I was like, oh, I get it now, right? The transition from being single to a married person, it takes more than just someone pronouncing you husband and wife, right? And we were both sort of living in our married life as single people, sort of doing the same things, not. And so it's one of those things where you need to work with your people about what the change, not just the change, but what the transition, the new identity on the other side of the transition, what that on the other side of the change, what that means, because that's a lot of what the fear is about is who am I on the other side? Who are we as a department, as an organization, as service providers or product developers, whatever it is, taking the time to understand who we are and what our identity is on the other side.
When you said that, when you're telling that story, I something popped up in my head, and the thing that popped up was, and I was going to say this earlier, but this is, I think, a more appropriate time to say it. Sometimes you need other people to help you through the transition. Whitnie and I are really well educated on change management when it comes to other people, but because we tend not to see things that are happening to us, or we tend to deny them, or we have blinders on, or whatever it is, it sometimes is harder to work through it on our own. And so in that particular case, that other person was able to point certain things out or say things that resonated with you that you couldn't see when you were in your own married bubble. And some people, if we want to talk about this and use that as an analogy, some people never get it right in a marriage,
Yeah.
which is why I guess there's a 50% divorce rate in the country, is because they're not able to see, okay, the
Yeah.
old way is over. There's a whole new set of rules that I
Yeah.
need to learn and to co-create. And some people aren't good at that. And that's another aspect of this. You need to co-create the rules, what's going to be different when it comes to change. The other aspect of that, talking about not knowing yourself, and it just jumped right out of my head when I said that. But I'm sure it'll come back to me. But it's really about co-creating things with your team and helping them move through the change and more importantly, the transition, the internal thing, and knowing that each person is going to be at a different spot emotionally and through that transition. That's really important. And sometimes we forget that. We're like, okay, everybody's in denial, everybody's angry. No, not everybody is angry. Some people may think it's great. I remembered what it was I was going to say. The other thing that we tend to forget, and we talk about why people would resist change, is this. Say you have a software you're using, and the software is not very good. Most people think the software is not good. There is one person in your organization who is an expert in that software. They know that software better than anybody else, and they're the person that everybody comes to when there's a problem. What's going to happen when so you're taking that expert and you're making that expert a beginner again. And that person is going to have a really strong resistance to that. You're taking that person's status away. You're taking that person's expertise away. You're taking that person's sense of security away when it comes to that particular thing. And maybe you've used that software for a long time, even though you knew it was subpar. That person got to feel like, oh, they're never going to change it, right? Because people are used to living with things that are not necessarily that great. And so that is a reason why someone might resist changing to something that's better. So just want to throw that out there.
It's interesting you bring up that example, because somewhere, and we went through something very similar to that. It wasn't any one particular person. It was, in fact, our IT department that wanted to continue with the systems that we had. And everyone was saying, it's, whatever year it was, right? And so it's like, well, that software is like, so yesterday, that was like 10 years ago when it was the thing. It is no longer the thing. And of course, we live in a society now where everyone has their own computers. You have personal computer, your software. So you're like light years ahead in using your personal devices, and then you go to work and you're using some antiquated thing. But that's exactly right. They had figured it out. They had mastered it. They knew how to address things that came up, and things were always coming up, which was the problem. It's like, well, if we upgraded this, we could move on. So I love that example, and have lived through it.
Well, think about what that does to a person, right? You just watch this person, because this software, whatever it is, has all of these workarounds and issues. That person's a genius to everybody else, because any problem you encounter like, oh, I know how to do that. It's this, 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 and this, right? Then you take that person and you're going to put them on par with everybody else. That's bound to create problems.
Well, the good news for them is that whoever the software providers, they'll train you and teach you everything you need to know so you can become expert again, just in time to change the software again.
Because that's what happens, right? We have it changes. And here's the thing, and we had an episode on VUCA a while ago, but the way this was taught to me was, not only are things changing faster than ever before, but different types of things are changing faster than ever before.
Yeah.
So we're in this, the changes are changing. So it is really hard to get a firm footing. The AI is the buzzword right now. It's going to become, that's going to be replaced by something else, or a new form of it, very shortly, I predict.
Of course.
Just when everybody's getting used to it.
And so here's the thing, right? AI is not new, right? And which is the interesting thing. I was reading something sort of about the history and evolution, and this goes way back. But of course, something came up that tapped into our collective consciousness. And so everyone's like, oh, this new thing, AI, and we have to adapt to it. And the thing is, we've been adapting to it for forever, right? Since it began, we've been adapting to it with, the smartphones and Siri and Alexa and all. I guess I should be careful. I don't want devices going off around.
My device just lit up when you said that.
The device is going off. But I want to get into something that you brought up, and that's the grief part of this, right? And tapping into, understanding grief and how grief fits into this.
Yeah. The way I see it, and we talked about this, is when you lose anything, it's kind of like a death, right? Yeah. It gets, because without, me, I try to avoid the woo-woo, but We'll use it to my benefit. But death is a change.
Accept it.
Yeah, yeah. Death is a change, right? It moves. You're moving from one state to another state, and that's what change is. You're moving, and especially when it involves you, you're moving from that expert state to that novice state. If we're using the software example, it's that change. And so there is a kind of death there. It's that same kind of feeling. I don't know if or when I'm ever going to see that software again. I love that software. I got used to it, all its quirks. You can say the same thing about a person, and now it's gone, and it's being replaced by something else. There is a grief there. There's a loss there. It's akin to a death, and that's how I like to. It's moving from one state of matter to another state of matter, if you want to look at it that way.
And so it's important to understand then what grief is and how it manifests. And so this is a generality. It is not necessarily so that it moves um, from one stage to another, and you can be in multiple stages of grief simultaneously. It's not linear, right? And so you may come back and forth, or the people on your team may come back and forth, but it starts with denial. And Robert had mentioned this earlier, right? So you have denial, anger, um, help me with the
Bargaining.
denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, right? And I think there's something
Depression.
else, depression, and
Mhm.
then acceptance, right? And so in general, there is a progression, right? And it's laid out in the model Kubler-Ross, and this model. But again, you can go back and forth between stages and revisit things. And you may or may not ever get to acceptance. Some people don't get to acceptance, right? And so, but in general, that's where it starts. So the change is happening, or you get the information that some change is going to happen, and you start with denial, and then you move to anger. And so I could say in that situation with the reorg, right? Had the consultant, I think, done a better job explaining, particularly to management, that this was going to be a process and this is how staff was going to react, that instead of getting to a place where it was, you guys need to just accept it, that we could have, as a unit, moved through that process a little more orderly and in a way that staff would have received ultimately the change a little better. And if management had taken the information that was being provided and say, this is not just them pushing back, but this is the process, we can take the information that they're giving us and inform the process to make sure that ultimately what we do is the best thing, which was the intent with I think with the consultant and the focus groups. But the grieving process, right, wasn't explained. And so another part of that was that quite a few people were let go or were offered opportunity, golden handshakes or handcuffs or whatever you call them, right, to effectuate this. And so there was some of that was a part of this as well, right? People that we'd worked alongside long time, all of a sudden not there. Does this mean other people might lose their jobs? And people that were moving up into management, if they didn't do their jobs well, would they get to keep those? How is a new manager going to affect me? Someone that I've never worked with before, someone I don't like, except, right? All the things were a part of it, and it wasn't explained, and people weren't allowed to actually work through that process. We were just told sort of there was denial and anger. It was like, get over it. We're moving on.
Right. And that's somebody who is at the finish line of the marathon telling you you're just starting. Why aren't you where I'm at? You know, you got 26 plus miles to run. Get here sooner, which is ridiculous. But I tend to think that a lot of things that prevent organizations from doing this really well is and I'm going to say this, and this is probably not going to be a very popular uh, idea, but the ego of the leader. And that is, I said you should get over it. Why aren't you getting over it? Well, they're not getting over it because they hadn't had the time to get over it.
Yeah.
And your title is not going to make somebody get over it. They can pretend they're over it. They can act as if, but there will always be an undercurrent of resentment or even anger. Whatever stage they're at, it's going to be there. And I've seen that in organizations, and just talking to leaders, they just could not understand why people weren't doing the thing that they were told to do. And they're, this is the C-level people are saying, well, because people have agency and people have ways that they can subvert what you're doing. You may think that because you're the leader, you know every possible trick and permutation that but people are very, very inventive, and when they want to be passive aggressive, and that's what you'll get if you start doing that. We've done it ourselves. You can we were kids at some point. Your mom says clean up your room. Sure, I'll clean up my room. Everything goes underneath the bed. It looks clean, but it really isn't clean. Or everything gets thrown in the closet, or worse. So we all have that behavior. And so in order to help people is you have to put a plan in place where you're building trust. At least in the example that you gave, there was at least the appearance of wanting to communicate with people to find out what was going on. A lot of organizations don't even do that.
That's true. That's very true. It's it's not any more helpful, right? We would say at least they were doing that. It really isn't any more helpful in the end, but you're right. So the point of our conversation or this discussion here is so that you can understand that this is a part of the process. And so instead of responding as that organization did, or organizations that don't even make the attempt, now you can say, okay, this is what I can expect, right? In the form of resistance, that this is what I can expect. Now you can work through it because you understand what you're getting and not just seeing it as, oh, they're resisting, they don't like change, they just need to get over it. Right now you can say, oh, I get it. They're working through a process to help them come to a place, and it's your job to help them move through the process. One, now that you know, you can let them know, right? This is the process. And so where you are at any given moment is where you are. It's not my job to rush you through what you're feeling, but as you're working through what you're feeling and you're providing further information for me or the management, right? We can use that to help people move along.
Yeah, and I wanted to just tack on. It's not my job to rush you through, but I do need you give you a deadline by which the change is going to take 100% hold. Right? So
no, we don't stop the change, but
right.
I don't make you feel bad for being where you are as a part of, and we can help you move through at the same time.
Right.
So I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, and the reason why I'm saying that is because they need to know, and some organizations they do the other thing, right? They need to know that, hey, your feelings are, your feelings are valid. But however, this change is going to happen, and we need everybody, moving in this direction, or to accomplish this, or else we need to have a different, not so good conversation, right? So it's being transparent about that, because a lot of
Yes.
people, oh, your feelings are valid, and right? And then later on they're like, well, you're getting fired, right? Because we didn't tell you that by, February 20th, you need to have this. This is when the organization is going to make that full transition into this,
Yes.
and you need to be ready. And it's my job to get you there. And if you don't want to get there, that's okay too. Let's talk about some of your options and alternatives. Maybe this isn't the organization for you, because we're doing that, and having that compassionate conversation about that. Not like, you're going to do this or else, which is what a lot of people. I was with an organization for years. That was their motto with everything. It was like, we're force feeding you the liver. You're going to eat it, or you don't eat it at all. Right? It's like, we're going to fire you. And, do I get a chance to talk about how you're going to make this food that I can't stand? You get, not a great analogy, but I think most people hate liver.
It's probably a perfect analogy,
I
because
saw
most
you
people
say,
don't like it. Most
don't
people
like
don't
liver,
like it.
right? But you know what? And I use that analogy because when I grew up, we didn't have a lot of money, and my mom would buy liver, and I would, oh my goodness, we're having this.
I'll starve,
Yeah,
right?
well, but
Liver and Coca-Cola. Oops, I shouldn't have said it like that. Any cola.
yeah,
Like, if you could have a meal of liver and pick a cola, I would just assume.
not eat, right? But if it was the only, well, so the conversation was, I, I'm going to buy this stuff. How do what would just,
How would you make
it
me
tastes
look
terrible.
sick?
But I have to tell you, she got to a place where she would make it taste okay. But it was because we were like, we're not eating that. but
Some other time you'll have to tell me. And it doesn't matter. There's nothing you can do to it that's gonna make
yeah,
it
and
sour.
I chose that because most people are like, oh no. But look, and that's how it is with change in a lot of organizations.
Yeah,
People see it
yeah.
just like that, and
Take
it's
it or leave. It's take it or leave it. You
take it or
can
leave
eat it
it.
or not. You can stay or you can go. Um, and I'm not saying in the end that some of that isn't appropriate, but it, helping people to understand, and you as a leader understanding that there's a process, and helping people move through the process as you are implementing the change, can be helpful. And unless you're planning to just let people go because that's part of what the plan is, right? And that you're couching as something else, then maybe you don't have to end up in that place. So,
Absolutely.
but I get your point. I want to share an example that it's another personal example, but it's work related, that incorporates this concept of grief along with it was something that I wanted, right? So when I left my last job, um, it- the change itself, and I will say this, I was 100% on board with the change at the point at which I made the decision to make the change, to leave, right? The process of actually getting to that place where I decided that I was going to go and I set a date for going, I went through some of the things we talked about earlier. I went through the fear, right? I dealt with fear. I dealt with, what's the unknown. And am I going to be able to live off of what I do when I leave here? Because the whole plan was to be self-employed, right? To run my own business, and so as I was thinking through the options, there was a lot of fear about whether or not I was going to be able to do that, and I delayed making the decision for quite a long time. right? Out of that fear. And then eventually I went to an event. I was at a Tony Robbins event, and there was an exercise that we did there. And the decision that I made at Tony Robbins was that I was going to leave that job. I put a date certain on it. And I once I'd made that decision, I didn't waver from it, right? And it was still scary. I still had fear. And then here's the thing, that the transition that happened afterwards and the grief, I didn't stop to think about that was going to be a part of the process. And so I was very excited the last day of work. And, there was some sadness of people that I spent 10, 12, 13, 18 years working alongside, were people I was not going to see on a regular basis anymore, right? So I sort of anticipated that part in the grieving of the people, but there was another part that I didn't really stop to think about. And that was, for 40 years, I had been an employee, somebody's employee, for 40 years of my life. And it had not really dawned on me that going from employee to self-employed, that there was going to be something that I needed to navigate. And the first 2 weeks were fine because I left that job and went on vacation, right? I enjoyed myself, right? And I was like, oh, I'm free. And I had parties with family and friends, and I'm free and I get to do this thing. And everybody's like, oh, that's great. And then we came home from vacation, and I was sort of like, what do I do now? Right. And I started making decisions. Oh, I don't have to get up in the morning. Right. And so there were things that I was sort of embraced. Oh, I don't have to wake up at 3:30 in the morning to get up to go run with the group, and be home by 6 so that I could get dressed and get to the office on time. And right. So there were some real tangible things, but there were other things that I hadn't really stopped to think about that needed to be processed. And one of them was that I was no longer an employee. I didn't answer to anyone. And I didn't quite know how to do that, right? Because I had been so used to that. And so for the first couple of months of being self employed, I was sort of floundering. I didn't exactly know what to do. And I didn't realize at the time that it was grief, that's what I was going through, a process. I wouldn't say, I certainly went through the denial. I went through the denial, not about the change itself, but what I was feeling and what I was going through. Um, I don't know that anger was a part of it. Maybe there was some, and I rushed through it. I don't know. There was certainly some brief depression around it. It was masked because at the same time we did that, at the same time I was going through that change, we were in the process of buying a house. And then that got compounded by the house that were in contract on, had asbestos or mold or something that needed to be remediated and abated. And then we got out of contract. And so then I had that compounded on top of that. But once we got through the house thing and we settled in, I was able to clearly see that I wasn't doing anything that was moving my business forward. And at that point, I said, you need to give yourself permission to feel what you're feeling, right? So it had been masked, it's sort of been in denial about it. And at the point at which I said, let's face what's going on here, I was able to move on, get through to acceptance, and then things have been great since then. And so, again, it goes to that point, even if it's something that you want, right? Even if it's a process that you want, you're still subject to going through these stages of grief, because there's what was isn't anymore, and there's a new reality, and it's okay. It's okay.
There's a phrase, and it's like, nothing is so dear as what you were leaving behind. And right? It's
Even if it wasn't.
even even if it was, it's really funny, and we've seen it. We've been in bad relationships, and all of a sudden you're like, we did have some good times together. You had two, but that's okay. But because we all do that. Um, look, I've been in jobs where they were not good jobs, but I still have fond memories of those jobs because I met some fantastic people there, and
Yeah.
there were some good times. And when it was time to separate, you had that little knot in your throat, or that tightness in your chest, because you're like, I still have some fond feelings here. But it's one of those sayings that I didn't really appreciate until I started training people change management. Because like, and once I read that, I was like, oh man, that is so true. Because we've all been there. It's like, man,
Yeah.
that job wasn't so bad, right? We've heard people say it. You hated that job. What are you talking about? All you did was complain about it. You get a little distance, and it's like, yeah, you know what? It wasn't so. Yeah, it was. You hated it.
I will say this. There have been moments, I think I've even said on the show, right? That, yeah, I will say this. It wasn't that it wasn't, I would never say it wasn't so bad. I will say it wasn't as bad as I made it out to be, right? Having some distance and looking back, it wasn't, there came a point in time where it wasn't for me, but, it, and it served its purpose, right? Which is another thing that sort of clouds things. It
Yeah.
served its purpose, and I've grown in my personal development and recognizing that everything has value. That every experience is a learning experience, and therefore it had value. And it served its purpose, which leads us to where we are today. And but for that, you and I wouldn't be here having this discussion today. So, yes, right? We could turn, which reminds me, and maybe I'll bring it up next week when we finish this conversation, is I don't think it was quite a Dear Abby, but there was some article that I read about somebody in an organization and something that they went through, and I think it'll be instructive. So I'll make a note to bring that next week, and we can tap into it a little bit. But before we wrap up for today, just in a minute or so, I want to make sure that we touch on some strategies that can be helpful for moving through this. So, what are a couple of tools or strategies that you recommend to your clients or have used yourself moving through some change management?
For a team or for
But
individual?
yeah, for well, teams are made up of individuals, so yes, either or both.
The first thing is really build trust. You have to build trust, and that should have happened from day one. You have to build trust. Your team needs to trust you, and you need to create this. The part two to that is a safe place where people feel that they
Yeah,
can come to you and tell you how they're feeling. And a lot of people have problems with that. If I tell you that I'm having a hard time with this, and here's why, don't punish them for letting you know that.
yeah,
Acknowledge their emotions, and the big thing is, if you can get people involved in the change, because people will do what they create, and if they can have a part in that, it helps them accept it more, because they are actually creating the change. Sometimes you can't do that, um, and if you can't provide them support, it could be emotional support, it could be educational support, it could be remedial educational support. Whatever support you can provide them will help them through the
yeah.
change.
Awesome. And what about individuals?
Well, I think the main thing for individuals is something that came up when you were speaking earlier. Get with somebody that can help you through the change. I feel bad saying you need a coach, but you need a coach that is versed in
Yeah,
helping somebody through change. It may be even I don't want to say more serious, but it may even be to the point where you may need to talk to a therapist, just somebody who can help you deal with the change. And then that's one thing, but the other part of it is not just talking about it, but know where you are in that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, that U curve before you get to acceptance. Know where you are, and then come up with strategies or work with somebody to come up with strategies to help you move through those phases and through that transition. I think that's what an individual can do to help them through change.
Awesome. I think we'll leave it at that for this week. That is part 1. And we will be back next week for part 2, and we'll continue our discussion about change, dig into how you can actually take acceptance and turn it into action, right? So once you get people there, let's keep them moving. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us for part 1 of our discussion on change and how to make it easier for yourself and in your organization. Robert, if someone wanted to work with you on some change process that they have in their lives, how would they go about doing that?
They can reach me at inspireme@roberthilliardcoaching.com. That's my email, or they can go to roberthilliardcoaching.com and just go to the contact form, fill out that contact form, let me know what goals or challenges you have, and we'll set up a discovery call and we'll work through some options for you.
Awesome. And if you'd like to reach out to me, feel free. shiftingintoaction.now.site, shiftingintoaction.now.site. And again, we want to thank you for joining us. If you have a topic that you would like for us to cover, please reach out to either of us or both of us, and we will see how we can make that happen. And until next time, right, keep changing, because you're going to change anyway. So may as well embrace it. Let's make it easier. Take out some of the resistance by recognizing that it is a part of the process, and putting a name to it, right? Identifying it, putting a name to it, and making choices to move forward. So with that, we'll see you next week. Continue our discussion about change. Until then, take care.
Bye now.